everyone. Today we will be discussing Just Enough, Dead Space Horror and Player Choice for this year's Game Accessibility Conference North America 2023. We will be discussing today the inclusion considerations that were taken into account for Motive's Dead Space for the remake that came out earlier this year. We will be discussing gore mitigations, so the content warnings, hiding disturbing scenes, and so on. We will structure this into the why we did it, what we did, how we did it, and then from there, what's next. But before we dive into this, we do want to point out that Dead Space is a gory and violent game, and though we will be discussing today mitigation related to hiding disturbing scenes and content warnings and such, we do want to give a heads up that this game does have blood and it does have gore. And that's hard to avoid when discussing these conversations today. And so we will have a little exclamation point icon that we will have on slides when there might be some blood or some gory aspects of the games. And we will try to verbalize that too as well. But we do just want to give that quick heads up before we dive into it. So without further ado, let's do some very quick introductions. I'll pass it over to Christian, who will talk about himself.
Thanks, Morgan. So I am Christian Simon. I started a while ago as a UI designer when it meant way more than just UI designer now. It was part GD, part UX, part UI, part technical designer. And I worked on numerous titles, especially in the Assassin's Creed brand, on the For Honor game, and more recently on Star Wars Squadrons. That all led me eventually to have my own experience design team, where I'm the director on the Iron Man project at EA.
And I'm Morgan Baker, and I'm a game accessibility lead here at EA. I am a game accessibility specialist, inclusive designer, and I've been working in this broader realm of inclusion for a number of years now. I've worked with Xbox, Exploding Kittens, Netflix Games, so many more. And it's really exciting too to be doing this talk today. I was joking with Christian earlier because one of the last times I presented at this conference, I was talking about accessible and inclusive horror, co-presenting along with a couple other lovely folks. And so it's really, I feel like I'm coming full circle today with this talk. So excited to be here and chat about my two favorite things, which is inclusion and horror games. Moving on then, we're going to dive right into the why did we do this? And to give the very fast summary, games are for everyone, and horror games are no exception. In fact, the Dead Space team actually took inclusion into consideration very early from the get-go and beginning to consider how can they make the game more approachable and inclusive to more players. In fact, we can kind of take a look at some of the settings and options that are in the game right now. The remake expanded on its options with a more robust subtitle suite. It has additional control remapping and sensitivity capabilities. It has input alternatives, such as like swapping sprint and aim to a toggle, as well as single press QuickTime events. And there's stuff by design too. We were often leveraging legacy design when doing this. Keep in mind, the game is a game that has already existed, and this is a remake. But a good example of this would be the locator lines as a perfect prime example where it helps kind of get players on where to go. Of course, as always, there's room for improvement, but the inclusive design between the original game and the remake is objectively evident. And as an aside, I'm quite proud of the team for all the work that they did and accomplished, because I know that this is a very large lift, and I'm appreciative of it selfishly, but as well as I know that this is just great for the community to make the game more accessible in general. But for inclusive design, why did we consider adding player choice like gore mitigation, content warnings, hiding disturbing scenes? Why did we consider this? And so it's kind of broken down into three things. The first and most apparent is that it extends to more players. When setting to make the remake itself, a big primary goal was we want more people to play the game. How can we make, though, a horror game more inclusive to everyone? Or I like to flip this question a lot. how is this specific horror game being exclusionary? Broad questions like this have come up even before mine and Christian's time on the franchise. And so the game team wanted to focus on allowing more players to enjoy the game. The original thinking being we want to extend to not just horror fans, but action and adventure enthusiasts as well. And so through lots of research, we found that people actually liked the puzzles and the story arc that the plane has to offer, or the game has to offer, but they're not maybe not the most extreme aspects were very fun for them. And the more disturbing moments that maybe go beyond the typical thresholds. And so we wanted to extend to more players. The next two from here is we wanted to provide our players with agency and player choice. Inclusive design can offer choice when a single design solution cannot account for all user needs and preferences. That's a chunky sentence that often came up often for us. And to be clear, Dead Space is a horror game with violence and gore. Jump scares is part of the combat. Literally, the fundamental gameplay involves like dismembering bodies. That's like literally part of the first-person shooter or third-person shooter. It's horror is a pillar, but just because something is a game pillar doesn't mean we shouldn't consider inclusive design. So the solution here was providing agency and player choice, and this is often something that we discussed throughout the considerations. So giving players the choice to stay informed, whether it's inside or outside the game, the choice on whether they want to experience certain content, or considering things outside the game, such as like what type of horror is in this game versus within the game, to keep them informed and have that agency. So that's their second one. And then the last, and maybe the most important, is inclusive design is just good design. I say this really often, and I know Christian does as well. When we talk a lot about inclusion, we know that being inclusive is just good for the product. Horror mitigation does have a specific set of players in mind, but it does extend to many. And we know that this is true too, because this type of work has been considered for decades. We have Valorant, which has the turning off blood. We have Soma, which has a safe mode. We have Assassin's Creed, where you can adjust sensitive content. You have Chicory and Inkenfell that has content warnings, and so on. The list goes on forever. So it's really something, and it's evident through the constant presence in our industry, that this is actually good for the product. And we want to consider how to make games more inclusive through this good design principle. So we went to the drawing board using user insights and different types of research, collaborating with devs and experts alike. We brainstormed many ideas that we will talk about today to bridge this gap. There are tons of ideas that came up, many inspired even by some of our own experiences, and others generated through player feedback. So we're going to dive into then the what we did, the how we did, and what's next from there. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Christian. He's going to begin with the what.
Thanks. So what did we do in regard with what Morgan just talked about? Well, we started first with out-of-game initiatives to consider basically the whole player's journey and from outside the game to the game itself. So outside the game, efforts were made for to warn the players about the content warning and what to expect in the game. So that's even before they engage into the game to make sure that everybody's aware. In game, what we did, as was mentioned briefly earlier, is we provided content warning during the boot flow. So this was as precise as possible without being spoilery too much. And we provided a QR code that would lead you directly to the web page that I just mentioned. Also, we had, of course, accessibility options regarding the disturbing scenes and the content warning and the features themselves. So with that, which we're going to talk about in a second, content warning and the hiding of the disturbing scenes. Now, how did we do it? Well, first of all, it needs to be mentioned that this is a team effort. As many of you already know, game features always are a team effort. It needs more than one department to do it. This is true for this features also. So here we definitely had a bunch of people in game design, UX, technical design, the level designers, technical artists, UI, QA. There's also audio in there that's not there, but as you can imagine, there's a lot of people involved. So how did we settle on the disturbing scene features? Well, we start proposing features in different area of the game. The first one was dismemberment mitigation. So features that were tackling that specific aspect of the game. Also, we had proposals for blood and gore visuals and some about disturbing scenes.
Yeah, and with this as well, a lot that was taken into consideration was thinking about features that would have an extremely high reach and an extremely high impact for the player personas that we have in mind for this. And so that's where the three of these things kind of came up through using that user research, through those insights, as well as leveraging the philosophies of, do these features reach people and how impactful are they? And these are the three that came up.
So yeah, actually that's a good segue, because we had to put those proposals against the production reality. So while the ideas were all good in their way, getting mitigation features like this in the game was not a simple process. We had to consider capacity. Do we have the people and the time to make the feature? We had to put that against the scope of the game. Does it mean a completely refactor of what is already there when we want to put those features in, or is it simpler than that? And also priority. Production, especially a remake, usually has a shorter production, which was the case here, than a regular or even a new IP, say. So we needed to make sure to prioritize this feature against the others. So what that meant was that in regard of those three sets of proposal, we figured that dismemberment mitigation was very high, had a very high impact on gameplay. Of course, it was the core of the game. And also it meant major code refactoring. For the blood and gore visuals, it was affecting a lot of departments. We have blood and gore in the gameplay, but also on the walls, in cinematics. So a lot of departments were affected, and a lot of rework or refactoring of some of those existing pipelines that were already there needed to be addressed. On the disturbing scenes part, we needed, one of the challenge there was to identify what was disturbing in an already potentially disturbing game. And we knew that those scenes would need manual interventions to be able to work properly. It was not a automated process for sure. So in the end, we had to settle on the disturbing scenes for the reasons I mentioned. Those were the disturbing scenes basically resisted the production reality examination. All right, so what is a disturbing scene? We had to establish a razor. What are the scenes we should hide or warn people about? And how to establish that in a disturbing game that has horror as a game pillar. So on one side, we have horror as a game pillar, and minute-to-minute gameplay is very violent. I mean, we have dismemberment. So what was the next step for us? What was the razor? How would we approach that?
And so the question is then, what makes the violence and gore more acceptable is the setting and the targets of the violence itself. And so first of all, we have to say realistic style. It has a very realistic style, but it's still a fantasy. And it has a sci-fi setting with impossible creatures. And so what we did is we narrowed in when discussing disturbing scenes to be violence towards humans. And this includes self-inflicted or otherwise related. In fact, we often talked about these violence towards humans and why we picked this, and we really settled on it's important because it hits closer to home and it's difficult to aspects of reality and the things that we experience in real life. And so we focus a lot on there's lots of gore, lots of violence, but let's focus on the violence towards humans itself when evaluating these disturbing scenes. And so the list of disturbing scenes and events with this razor itself, we took into consideration cinematic moments, the next being pickups with database and logs, and then last being a player's death sequence itself. And we converted this into 38 events with violence towards humans, which is a lot of events and not particularly surprising for this game. So moving from there then, we took into consideration a scene score itself, giving ourselves a very simple scoring of a 1 through 3, where 1 mentions sensitive content and 3, it's directly experiencing the content, whether it's through gameplay or watching a cutscene. And then from there, we took into consideration a gruesome score, they called it. Again, a simple 1 to 3, where the 1 is typical for this game, typical level of blood and gore. I have to say for this game because every game has different thresholds, so we worked that out. Versus 3 being like excessive, like tons of blood, tons of gore, and very, very disturbing. And we then converted this into what we called it's hard to say, disturbedness rating to basically help us understand what scenes were more or less disturbing. Of course, this is a little subjective here, and we did have a lot of interactive discussions on, well, this scene maybe doesn't meet perfectly, but maybe we bump up, bump down, and so on. But this was just to help us stay grounded and consistent. And you can see here too, we're applying the scores to each scene and resulted in a disturbedness for each event. So we have the scene score, we have the gruesome score converted together into that kind of rating to help us kind of say which things should we be including. And so from there, we applied the scores to each of the scenes, had the events, and we focused on the things that scored a 5 and 6, which were considered in our minds egregious in terms of disturbing content. We didn't focus on the 2 through 4 because we were trying to avoid being intrusive and also keep it within scope as well. But even then for the 5 through 6, of that giant number of things, it was still a large number. We had 22 most disturbing elements, which again, not surprising for this game. But that's where we narrowed in from there.
So how did we integrate those features in the game? So as Morgan mentioned, we had disturbing scenes, we had pickups in consoles or data logs, basically, that you can pick up or witness, and we had player's death sequence. So let me go through each of those and tell you exactly how that panned out. So first of all, here's your first icon for upcoming disturbing content. The following video that I'm going to show is the in-game disturbing scenes that introduce one of the creatures in Dead Space, and one of the crew member gets brutally killed by it. There's not going to be any visual mitigation for it. We want to show without, and I'm going to explain afterward. And I'm going to show the version of that video with the mitigation options on, but the first one doesn't have that. So you are warned.
And we'll have audio off for this as well. So if you want to look away, don't worry about that. I will describe very briefly what's happening though on the screen, but I won't include the dirty details. So here we have Isaac and he's walking down a hallway. He turns left and sees a room. There's a glass panel behind and someone's begging for help. An enemy is behind him and brutally killing them. Isaac's comrade has passed away.
So now, and by the way, this is about the only time we're going to do this. For the other features, I'm not going to show a before and after, just going to show the before, and then I'm going to show a breakdown of the after, but you'll see. So this is the next video is the same scene, but with active mitigation options. Still no sound.
So here we're in the same corridor. Isaac walks down. A content warning appears that says the upcoming section contains depictions of a bloody death. Isaac turns the corner, and in the same spot where the previous person we saw has passed away, instead there's a blurred image obscuring what's happening on screen. The captions still indicate that the scientist is calling for help. Isaac's comrade is dead again. Almost like it's the name of the game, Dead Space.
Exactly. So to break it down, so first of all, what we had to do is set a large zone around those scenes. So those were needed to be manually placed around a scene and far enough so that you, as a user, as a player, you'd have time to actually see the warning, read it without being in danger, first of all, but also without encountering the actual scene at the same time. So, and we had to cover all the possible exit or entry points, rather, to that scene. That being said, Dead Space, it's not an open world, so there were not too many, but still, it was taken into consideration for some of the scenes. So when those manually placed zone were entered, that's where if you had the option on, you'd get the content warning. The text, the content of that warning would be descriptive enough to give you a fair idea of what to expect, but also not to be too much of a spoiler. And since those scenes were in game, meaning that it's not a cinematic moment where you lose control of the character, you could actually walk around or get another angle of what was happening. It was important that the effect, the blurred effect, was actually also a zone on top of the scene. So you could actually circle, if you could circle around the character and get the same effect. And the blurred effect was the one chosen because it fit a bit more the narrative here. It was better than pixelated, say, or just a black square. So that's why the blurred effect was chosen. And then when you get out of the scene, the gameplay would resume without the blurred effect because you could encounter enemies in there, and so you didn't want to have any blurred effect on top of your gameplay events or if you were starting to fight. So yeah. Next is the pickups and consoles. So you can in Dead Space you can encounter consoles or pick up items that would provide you a video log or audio log of event that happened on the ship. Some of them were problematic because we identified them as disturbing. So what you're going to see here is a video showing the witness actually showing the death of the captains in a gruesome way. So this is not this hasn't any mitigation option.
So Isaac's entering a room. He picks up a video log. The video log plays. Characters are chatting back and forth. A character struggles, the others hold them back. They brutally assault the other character.
All right. So here, I'm going to be describing the breakdown of what the mitigation options are. So what we did here was set up a small zone. So it's the same idea than before, but it's a smaller zone around the object or the console that was affected, where we'd show the content. So same idea. We talk about what's upcoming in the video log or the console when you activate it. To note also that those two options, the disturbing scene, the high disturbing scene, and the content warning, are two different features. So they could be toggled separately or together. Here I'm showing together. So when you do play it, but if you have the high disturbing scene option on, you wouldn't see the content warning. Yeah, you wouldn't see the scene. You'd see the content warning. Another thing that was that we did was, since those video logs were stocked into your database, it was important to have the same feature accessible through the database. So when you go into the database, you'd go over that entry, like here, Captain's Fate, you'd see visually a content warning label, but also the content warning at the top right of the screen.
Also, I want to jump in and say as an aside that this is a great example of how the game team had to constantly think of, I don't want to call it like a pitfall, but like where this mitigation also needs to be considered in moments just like, oh, wait, players can replay this. We need to make sure that this feature is also associated. And so this is just like a constant thing. It goes back to what Christian mentioned earlier, where it took a village to do this because lots of folks were constantly thinking about this mitigation and how to make sure that it's holistic and has full coverage.
Very true. It's not a surprise. So when you'd watch the video log again in the menus, you'd have the same effect. All right, the last case is the player's death. So again, I'm going to show a video of Isaac being attacked by a necromorph and he's getting killed. And this scene is without any mitigation option.
Yeah, it's particularly brutal.
It's fairly brutal.
So Isaac's getting attacked by an enemy who is essentially, Isaac has to smash A to escape. In this case, that's not happening for the sake of showing the cutscene. And the enemy does brutally murder Isaac in this instance with lots of blood, lots of gore.
Here I'm going to break down the player's death mitigation options. It's a bit different in this case because we don't have a zone around, we don't need a zone like the other features. However, all the player's death are fairly gruesome. The one we showed in the video is actually one of the mild one, where he just falls and the necromorph is on top of him. But especially during boss fights or even other time, there's a lot going on, and it's fairly brutal. So when he gets attacked, here the thing is, just before he dies, it's very violent, but you can always get out of it. If you press A, smash A, you can get out of it. So there's no death involved. So it's fairly violent, but there's no mitigation option for that part. It's when the player dies, when he's reached 0 health, that's when there's a black screen hiding the cinematic, the death sequence, and there's a content warning that shows up. telling you that there's a graphic dead scene occurring right now. And then afterward, we resume gameplay as usual. So going forward.
So where does this leave us then? How does this work continue going forward? And did we actually succeed? And what more can be done? Those are a lot of questions that we had after doing this work. And so the ultimate conclusion of did we succeed in our goal is it's not a perfect implementation, but that's okay because it's part of the journey. So when we looked into different insights and looking into data, we found that for those who did benefit from this feature, the sentiment and usage was fair. In fact, for the content warning page, which is the www.com page itself that details the warnings and the available mitigation that players can use, when it was on launch, it had 10,000 unique players right after launch, which we were chatting about, like, was that good? That's bad. And that's fairly decent given that you can only access the page through either a direct link or a QR code. It's on par with what we would expect there. Also, too, in terms of the content warning feature itself, it was used by over 30,000 players after launch, with many also opting into the hiding disturbing scenes as well. Because keep in mind, those are separate features. And so a lot of people clicked on the content warning and some clicked on the hiding disturbing scene in addition to that. Quite frankly, given how difficult it is to benchmark something like this, especially in the context that this is a very, very gory game with lots of violence and knowing its audience, we were pleasantly surprised by this usage. And we do know it's a continuous journey. And if this feature even helped just one player, we consider that a win. And we did find that it did help players. We had players reach out saying, I'm part of the target audience, love this feature, I was using it all the time. There's actually an article that was written by Grant Stoner, which mentions implementing these options didn't detract at all from the core themes of the game, fear, helplessness, and the general sense of isolation, which is great because we were trying to balance the whole aspect that horror is a pillar, but we want to make this, something available. And so it's good that we were getting that balance where he finishes off saying that it's clear there was a clear effort to welcome the often underrepresented group of players, which we're glad that that was evident. And we did see players reach out with sentiment as well. We did also find that the design did extend to many, even though we had a specific base in mind when considering this design. We had tons of people. The most surprising, but in retrospect, not surprising, it was streamers reaching out saying that the feature was super helpful for them. Because if you're familiar with streaming like a horror game, especially if you're a variety streamer, is like a high risk thing because not everyone wants to watch a horror game. But having this horror and having this ability to hide disturbing scenes, a ton of streamers found it very, very helpful. And so that was a pleasant surprise. And I think a good indication of inclusive design in the sense of design for one extent to many. Glad that that helped those folks as well. But can we conclude then that this design was effective? And that's a bit hard to track and measure. But the simple conclusion, again, is that not perfect, but it's a continuous journey. Inclusive design means constant iteration, learning from our players, others, and our larger community to better understand how we can make our games less exclusionary. And inclusion doesn't just happen overnight. We focus on making these strides, celebrating the wins, and reflecting on what more we can do. And we do have to also point out that we did notice some people didn't always quite get the feature, especially if you followed online. There was some confusion, well, isn't Dead Space a horror game? Why was this taken into consideration? And that's okay. You heard this talk today on why we considered it. And of course, it's not perfect, but it's meant to be a stepping stone, and it's all about that iteration and improvement. So going forward, we do hope to continue doing better and honing in on our inclusion craft. And we hope that by sharing our methods and learnings with everyone today, others will be inspired to continue to do the same. Hey. So thank you so much for coming out today. If you want to learn more, you can check out, we have ea.com/accessibility, which I'll make sure to post in the Discord chat, as well as ask the folks over if you're watching this on YouTube We'll have it in the description as well. But we appreciate you all coming out to chat with us here today about this. And I want to give a huge shout outs to Christian and his team for this hard, incredible inclusion work and just pushing the boundaries once again.
Thanks, Morgan. It was a pleasure anyway. And it was good to work with you again.